I just can't help but smile when I see this. It is just so cool to see so many people, new and old friends, and watching this interaction. And I see people here from all over. We have a lot of people in Dallas and Houston, San Antonio. I see people from London and outside of London, suburbs north. Manchester's one. I see some people here from Mumbai, India. Thank you. And it's just, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And it touches me because when we started out, now going on 7 years, and it was Patty and myself and a nurse. And now we're 2,400 plus patients are part of our network. This meeting, we have 100 and let me and bit more people. We have 148 people registered, which in the world of Zoom for meetings like this, it's a big meeting. And you all are here for the same purpose, to share, to learn, and help each other. So I want to say thank you. All of your microphones are muted. If they're not muted, please keep them muted. The best way, if you're on a computer, not an iPad or a phone, if you're on a computer, the best way to do this is keep your microphone muted and use your space bar when you talk. When you press it down, talk, release it, it goes back to mute. Otherwise, we get a lot of background sounds and it's kind of icky. Secondly, we'll have a question and answer session after Dr. Mathai is done with her presentation. And the way to raise your hand now, there's a new feature here. And if you look on your screen, you'll see a thing called emoticons or graphics. And if you look at emoticons, if you click on it, it's going to bring up a whole bunch of graphics. And one of them is a hand. On your system, it might be a hand, it might be a thumb. But if you click one of those,
you probably haven't done.
You promise not to go crazy by using all the other emoticons. Just click on an emoticon and we'll see it. And we have Teresa Genovese today, who's our new producer, or I'm going to call her a producer in training. And this is her first meeting, who will be kind of watching for that. And when the question comes in, she'll either engage with you by text or pass that information on to Dr. Mathai to answer. And I think it's going to be an effective system. Let me let a few more people in here. So it's going to be a great meeting. And I want to thank you all for coming. And let me first start off with a short survey. One of the things that we've all asked ourselves, I think, is about COVID. And so I'm going to ask a few questions. The first one is, have you had the first and second jab? I'm going to use our UK words, and you should see that on your screen. And just answer it. There's no names here. This is all anonymous. So just answer based on your feelings. Some of you have had it. Some of you don't want to have it. And I'm not going to even discuss the reasons why, yes or no. But we're just trying to get some idea of our membership and look at the numbers that are clicking in. I'm not sure you can see those yet, but I'm going to show it in 2 seconds. Because we have right now an overwhelming number of people that have not had the vaccine, that need to, candidly, but I'm not going to pick on you, I promise. And a lot of people who had the first jab, not always the second, but we're going to see the numbers. You should see those numbers on screen. Are you seeing Shelley, are you seeing those?
Hey, Bill,
Yeah.
the submit button doesn't seem to work.
It doesn't work. Submit for what?
For
The poll.
for your survey.
Answer all three.
You have to answer all the questions, unfortunately, to submit.
Just put the yeses and nos. So and then it works.
Yeah, I think it works if you answer all three questions.
Yeah, people here. But the results are just, it's very interesting. And Dr. Mathai, I hope you're seeing this as well.
I actually am not seeing the results.
Not seeing the results. Okay. Well, this is operator error because I'm not sure how to do it. Let me end the poll. That should show it on your screen. Do you see that? You should.
If not, just read it.
Okay, here's, I'll give you the top-down quickie recap. 93% of you have had the first jab. 90% have not had any jabs. And 45% have had the first jab. So we have some people with the first, a lot with the second, and then an equal number that say, no, thank you. And I'm not going to address those issues. Dr. Mathai might want to talk about that in her discussion, but I think it's a very, very interesting result.
Oh, here we popped up. It says, it looks like, 40% have had both. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah.
The first.
45% have had
40%.
both. 93% have had at least the first one, and 10% have not had the vaccine.
Very interesting numbers to me, because our community, first and foremost, people forget sometimes, before we were all patients and caregivers, we were people, and we're educated people, and we're at a certain age where we take no prisoners and ask questions. And so for me, seeing this number is kind of revealing, and it's different than what I'm seeing in the national media or press. It's a very different number. And I think it's one that we should kind of, at some point, and I don't want to take you off track, Dr. Mathai, but it might be an issue you want to simply touch on.
Bill, I think it's the way we ask the question. I think we're getting some false answers just because they didn't know how to answer. Scott and I actually didn't. And so I think we came back with some.
Looks like the majority.
Yeah.
It looks like the majority of people have at least gotten the first dose,
Yes,
which is really good.
That's what we focus on.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'm going to let I'm going to call her our superstar VP of events, Shelley Mathis, introduce our speaker. Shelley, you are on.
Thank you, Bill, very much. Life after the vaccination. Oh, my goodness. Well, first, we've got one of my very personal favorites speaking today, Dr. Susan Mathai, who graciously is filling in for another physician who was going to talk about nutrition today. And when we found out that some of our lung transplant patients were getting the vaccination, but they weren't building up the antibodies. And Dr. Mathai has been working on some of the vaccination projects. I knew we had to absolutely talk about the vaccination. And one of them, even my own husband, who takes rituximab, they said that's one of the drugs where people were not building up the antibodies. So my goodness, this is really affecting our community. So we have a lot to know. Luckily, we have Dr. Susan Mathai, undergraduate education, Harvard University. I knew not to apply at Harvard, did you? Anyway, Harvard University, medical school, Yale University School of Medicine, internship, internal medicine, Mass General, residency, Mass General, fellowship, pulmonary critical care, University of Colorado, other fellowship and pulmonary critical care research fellowship, University of Colorado. That is a very distinguished background, and her patients love her. She's great. Thank you, Susan Mathai. The program is now yours.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start sharing let's see if this works. Oh, I'm sorry. I think
Margaret Doobie, please turn off your microphone.
I have to, I'm sorry. I realized just now that my husband updated my computer. And so I have to quickly change the privacy settings so that I can actually share with you. So hang on one second.
Dr. Mathai, welcome to my world.
I'm going to have to relog in. Is that okay, Bill?
Sure.
I'm so sorry.
Sure.
I forgot that he updated the software. So 1 second, I'll be right back.
All right. Do you all think we'll ever have one meeting, just one, that everything works like it's supposed to and runs really smooth? I don't think we will. But, luckily, we're all part of the same family here, so we can kind of overlook those things. So anyhow, I apologize. Here comes Dr. Mathai coming back. And I have to admit her. Here we go. Yeah.
All right. Now I'm going to share. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is what happens when you let your husband mess with your computer before needing it. So, resume share. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of a lot of the issues that a lot of you guys are probably facing and kind of questioning a lot of information that's coming out about life after the vaccination and what's going on with COVID. Please yell if I'm not being heard or my screen sharing stops. I know sometimes Zoom can be funny, but hopefully it will work out okay. I can see the chat box, so if anything weird is going on, just please yell at me or mention it in the chat because I'm looking at that as I talk. So I'm going to start with just some slides just so that we're all kind of starting from the same place. And the last bunch of slides are actually, is it possible to enable the auto-generated closed caption? I don't know, so I will have to defer that to Shelley and Bill. But I'm going to start with a bunch of slides just talking about the vaccine. So we're starting at the same knowledge base. But also the last bunch of slides are actually questions that you guys submitted to Bill and Shelley. And so I'm actually going to list some of the actual questions and we'll have a conversation about the answers. So I want to start with my perspective because I think everybody's experience and when we talk about complicated situations like this, it's important to know where the person, where we're coming from. So let me see it. Is this better, Shelley?
Yes, it is.
Yes,
Can you guys see it?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, awesome. So I was, as Shelley mentioned, I take care of ILD patients and other advanced lung diseases. Many of my patients got sick and died over the last year. Some of them got better. Some of them didn't get better. A lot of them managed to avoid the sorry, I'm trying to do the subtitles for people. Is that working? Are y'all seeing subtitles?
yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we are.
Yeah.
So many of my patients survived. Many of my patients have managed to avoid getting sick, which was phenomenal. But obviously, it's been a hard year for everybody, for doctors and patients alike. So that's kind of what I've been working or experiencing over the last year. I was actually pregnant and gave birth during the pandemic. I didn't realize at first that I was pregnant. So I spent the first few months of the pandemic not knowing that I was pregnant and kind of taking care of inpatients and everything. So I went through that. And the only reason I mentioned that is that pregnancy is is a form of immunosuppression. And so some of the questions that we're dealing with are ones that I too was grappling with during the last year, trying to protect myself and my baby during COVID. I got vaccinated in the first wave of health workers. So as soon as it was available in Dallas, which was around December 15th, and while pregnant. So I felt confident enough in the data about safety that I got both doses while I was in my third trimester, and the baby's doing fine. So that is a question that comes up and something that's discussed a lot. And so I wanted to put that out there that I had that experience. I'm the daughter of an immunocompromised cancer patient in Dallas. And so much like you guys, we in our family have been negotiating risks and trying to stay up to date. And so we kind of have had a lot of those the same conversations in private that we're kind of having in public now. Our family has definitely had some close calls. So despite being a medical family and being, I think, pretty careful, there were some members of my family that got sick, and that we were very close to my mom and me when I was pregnant, being exposed to them in an indoor setting during family gatherings. So I understand how hard it is, even when you're doing everything that you think is reasonable, to avoid all exposure. So in terms of the outline, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the vaccines work in general, vaccine efficacy in general, who should get vaccinated. We're going to get to the mostly talk about the immunosuppressed patient issue and what our areas of uncertainty are now. And then people ask about boosters, and I'll touch really briefly on that concept, but there's a lot of unknowns there. And we can also have a discussion about what is okay now if you have, like most of you have been vaccinated, and then we will go straight to addressing questions and have it be more of a discussion. So caveats, these are my opinions based on current knowledge and published literature. So this field is rapidly changing. I could say something today where like tomorrow or the next day, some totally new data comes out, and I have to warn you that we're learning things every week. So make sure as new information comes out, what I say right now could change. And so make sure to be able to discuss new data that seems in conflict with what I'm saying with your doctor. All medical decision making about your particular case needs to be between you and your doctor, because I can't and won't know all the details about what you're dealing with. So I'm just kind of giving you as much as I can from a general, general PF patient perspective. Okay, so I'm starting with this slide, which is the kind of blockbuster figure from the paper that was published in December, I believe in December, that led to the emergency use authorization by the US FDA and also by other, I just don't know the names of the agencies in other countries, but the NHS and other European groups, the approval of the Pfizer vaccine. Now, the data for the Moderna vaccine is very similar. I just didn't want to overwhelm you guys with just slides of data. But the point here is this was probably better than any doctor or scientist dreamt that the results could be. Before the vaccine data, like back last summer when Dr. Fauci and other health experts were hoping that a vaccine would be, and talking about the potential for a vaccine, they were optimistically estimating, 60-70% efficacy with the first vaccines that come out. These vaccines are enormously effective. And what this graph is trying to show is the red line is people that got the vaccine, and the blue line is over time, the people that didn't get the vaccine. And the y-axis here is the cumulative incidence. So how many people of those have gotten, in those two groups have gotten COVID. And what you're seeing is over 119 days, which is from the original paper, about 2.4% of people, just under 2.4% of people who were in the placebo group got COVID. And this was not even, this was actual symptomatic COVID. And a remarkably lower number of people, so under 0.4% of people who got the vaccine during that time, that 119 days got COVID. This is where the numbers of greater than 90% efficacy comes from. And this is just a blockbuster result. I mean, when this was published, I mean, people in kind of doctor Twitter and stuff were freaking out, because this is one of the most beautiful results for this kind of study that you could have imagined. And so I think the profundity of the protection seen with the first couple vaccines developed was really more than we could have ever hoped for, and gave people a lot of hope about the fact that we could get through this pandemic and move back to normal life eventually. This kind of inset here, the smaller square there, shows you where that 14-day window comes from. So what they're showing is the lines are overlapping, so the groups are behaving similarly until about 14 days, where the lines start to separate, where you start to see the protection that people are getting from the red line from getting treatment, and so the lower incidence of COVID. So I want to pause there for a second and ask if anyone has questions about this, because I think really understanding this concept is really important to understanding that these are really effective vaccines. Does anyone want to comment on this right now? I don't know if
I have a comment, Dr. Mathai,
Yeah,
personal comment that applies, I think, to a lot of others. I've heard about getting the antibody test. I'm not quite sure how that works or how to go about that,
Or if you should.
or if
yes.
shouldn't.
We will get to that. And I think that's actually, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that next. So this is just, I will come to that. That's important. And I actually have pictures of what some of the antibody results that we send at our center look like. And Shelley mentioned or talks about the difference between mRNA and vector, and that's actually in the next couple slides. So I won't. Someone's asking about the AstraZeneca. I don't get into detail about it, but I will touch on that a little bit. This is the mRNA data looks this profound, but let's go to the next. So these are the kind of three, and I'm focusing mostly because our Brian asks, is a double-blind study. I believe so. Certainly blinded to the patients and doctors. So I mean, it would be a double blind because patients in these original studies actually didn't know if they were in the placebo group, and so had to be told after the study was over, hey, you were actually in the placebo, so you need to get vaccinated for real now. So that was actually something that people were not aware. And in fact, I've a really great story that I heard was of a reporter who happened to live in New York, and she was signed up for one of these trials. And after her doses, she was like, I felt so sick, and I was sure I got the real thing because I felt that fatigue and that mild fever and stuff that people talk about getting after the vaccine. She was like, I was sure I got the real thing. And then right after, when the results were published and they were able to contact the participants, she was contacted and turned out she got the placebo. So she had to go and get the real vaccine. And it turned out she had no side effects at all. So the only reason I mentioned that is that the placebo effect, like mentally about feeling crummy after a vaccine, is very profound, such that even people who received the placebo in these trials reported feeling crummy, even though all they got was like a shot of saline, which should cause no side effects. So I was double blinded for sure. So these are the three. I focus on these three vaccines because they're the ones that have EUA in the United States. But there's the Pfizer and Moderna are the mRNA ones. They're currently approved. Pfizer's approved for people over 16 years. Moderna's approved for over 18 years. And they're 2 shots given roughly 3 to 4 weeks apart, depending on which one you get. And you're considered fully vaccinated 2 weeks after your second shot. And what that means is the true efficacy and true like protection effects are really thought to start about 2 weeks after your second shot. They are currently enrolling for trials in actually, I believe they've already started. They already started trials in children quite a while ago. I don't know if those are closed yet. Because I'm not a pediatrician, I'm not referring patients to any of those directly, but it looks like they have some data because they've already, one of the 2 companies has already filed for emergency use authorization in approval in the United States for people over 12 years of age. So that's probably coming soon. The Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine is a 1-shot vaccine, and that's the viral vector one. So I'll talk in my next slide a little bit about that. And the benefit of that one is that the storage issues are less extreme. So mRNA is generally a very unstable molecule when it's by itself. And so for that reason, they require refrigeration in like extremely low temperatures, like way lower than a regular fridge. And so a lot of facilities don't have those kind of freezers. And so there's Johnson & Johnson's really important because the refrigeration is more standard and more available in more locations. So like rural places and not necessarily massive hospitals, but like, smaller facilities can vaccinate people, which is important in getting it out to people. It's also only 1 shot, so people don't have to come back for the second shot to get protection. Briefly, how do these mRNA vaccines work? I want to, my bolded statements on the side are specifically to address concerns that patients have. You cannot get COVID from the COVID vaccine. You may feel sick after the first or second dose. This is your immune system doing its job. And in fact, a lot of doctors who haven't felt that crummy after their doses are anxious that we didn't get as much of a vaccine response. So if you feel febrile or kind of run down after your first or second dose, that's actually in a way a good sign. In almost all cases, those side effects recover within 24 hours. For me, I felt crummy the night after my second dose. I didn't sleep very well, and I kind of had to power through the next day. But by the morning, other than being sleep deprived, I felt fine. It does not incorporate into your DNA. So you are not changing your own DNA. So how it works is that there's mRNA is like a code. Imagine it as like the recipe of how to make a protein, and it's in a in a sort of delivery device, and that gets injected into your arm. That mRNA in the delivery pod is taken up by the cells, and the mRNA is inside in the cytoplasm, so outside of the nucleus of your cells, and your body cells start using that. They find the recipe and they say, oh, I'll make this protein. And they make the spike protein that coats the virus in the COVID virus. That spike protein in those cells starts getting presented to your immune system, and your immune system reacts and makes antibodies and also triggers T cell activation against that protein. After that process, your body is then able to deploy antibodies and cellular immunity against things that have that spike protein on it. In this case, the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID virus, okay? That mRNA is rapidly degraded in your own cells. It never incorporates into your DNA. mRNA is an extremely unstable molecule, and so it is quickly destroyed. So you do not have to worry about that, the vaccine nucleic acid becoming part of your body forever. It's a totally transient thing. So that's kind of how the mRNA vaccines work. The viral vector vaccines are similar, but what they, instead of just using like kind of a pod to deliver them, it's actually using a disabled adenovirus. Adenovirus is just a different kind of virus that frequently is the cause of the common cold, but it's disabled from replicating. But all it is it's a way of delivering this mRNA into the cells of your body, so that you can make the same kind of antibodies and T cell response. Okay. So do you feel confident that vaccine doses work well, even if you had no side effects? I don't know that there's been any data that says if you didn't have side effects, you didn't get a vaccine response. We don't know that. This is just sort of like what people are thinking that, and I don't think that they've actually published a correlation between how severe your side effects were and how much antibody you make. It's just sort of a logical extension of kind of what we know about when our body is trying to create an immune response. So again, with the viral vector vaccine, the viral vector cannot replicate. So you don't have to worry about getting sick or seriously ill necessarily from the viral vector vaccine. Again, it may make you feel sick. That's your immune system doing your job transiently, but again, you should feel better within 24 to 48 hours. It doesn't change or integrate into your DNA, and it's a single shot, which is why this is an important tool in our fight against COVID. So to talk about, people are asking about efficacy levels. So what an efficacy level is it's not that you have a 5% chance of getting sick if you've gotten this vaccine. That's not what it means. It means it takes your risk of getting COVID and decreases it by 95%. So it doesn't. So this does not mean that 5% is like for the Pfizer or Moderna. It doesn't mean that 5 or 6% of people who get that vaccine are going to get COVID. That is not what it means. It's actually much, much, much lower than that. It means the small percentage of people that would have gotten COVID without a vaccine is reduced itself by 95 to 94 or 94%. So this is a remarkable, crazy efficacy. Like, I mean, just amazing that it achieved this. And what I want to focus on, the reason I blacked out part of this slide is because it was specific from the Canadian government. It was from a Canadian government source. I didn't want to focus on the Canadian government restrictions. So that's why this bottom part is blacked out. But the important part here is that even though the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines were reported in their papers lower levels of efficacy There are a couple caveats to that. One is that the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson trials were done later than the Pfizer and Moderna ones. And so they were dealing with a different landscape of variants and a different landscape of the pandemic in general. So that could have affected why they were only able to report slightly lower efficacy. And then secondly, in all of the vaccines, the hospitalization and death prevention was essentially 100%. And that's really important, right? Because if we think about what are we trying to avoid by getting vaccinated, we're trying to save lives. We're trying to prevent our healthcare system from getting overwhelmed. And so the fact that hospitalization and death prevention has been so phenomenally reduced, I mean, essentially eradicated with the vaccine, means that any of these vaccines you should get. So I know that there's been some stress about the fact that technically the reported numbers of AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are a little bit lower. So some patients and family members of mine have been like, well, I only want to get Pfizer. It's like, well, I mean, okay, I get that from the numbers that are reported, but the efficacy numbers were reported differently in each trial. So there are small differences in like how they counted an infection. So for instance, in the Pfizer trial, they were not prospectively screening their people. So you only were counted as a COVID infection if you actually got sick enough to go and get tested for COVID. Whereas in other cases, people may have been actually doing asymptomatic screening testing to actually diagnose the COVID. So this is why there's a star and an asterisk by the efficacy level. Yeah, and Brian's saying we're trying to decide what to get the one that's available. And I agree. Getting vaccinated to prevent hospitalization and death with any of these is the right thing to do. Get it as soon as you can, basically. Though we'll talk a little bit about the immunosuppression question in a second. So who should get vaccinated? Everyone that has not had severe reactions against vaccines. So that's almost every single person. I mean, there are very, very few people who've had true like anaphylaxis or other severe vaccine reactions. If you are one of those people, ask your doctor and talk through the risks and benefits. But for 99.9% of everybody, they should just get vaccinated. And like I mentioned, FDA is likely to approve the EUA for children 12 to 16 soon. So soon, many of our kids and grandkids can get vaccinated as well, which is really important and going to be a huge player in preventing and actually ending the pandemic so that the children don't become vectors for a kind of a remaining source of transmission. COVID asymptomatic carrier rates are also dramatically lower if vaccinated. And so this isn't, a couple of my patients have told me that they have children or grandchildren or relatives who are like, well, I'm 25, like I don't need to get vaccinated, okay? Because I probably won't get that sick. Well, first of all, that's true that they likely won't get very sick if they get COVID. That being said, there have been young people younger than myself who did get quite sick and were on life support at Baylor for COVID earlier in the pandemic. But more importantly, they need to get vaccinated to protect you and to protect everybody else around them, because there are going to be some people who don't mount the same kind of immune response. And so people who are healthy need to get vaccinated to prevent being carriers to those who are not either able to get vaccinated or don't have a good enough amount, the same strong immune response that a young healthy person would create to a vaccine. So I'm going to come back to this, but one of the most important things I think if you can take away from this is if there are people in your life who are young and they're like, well, I'm not going to get that sick, try to help them understand that it's not just about them. It's about the community. It's about the world. It's about ending the pandemic and getting kind of back to normal. What is herd immunity and why do we care? Okay, well, the idea of herd immunity, which is talked a lot about in the lay press, is that if the vast majority of people in a group are immune to a disease, you as an individual are going to have very low risk of getting it because nobody around you is going to have it or be able to give it to you. Now, the problem with the concept of herd immunity when it's discussed in the press is that there's no like definition of it, in like no hard and fast definition. So there's no percentage where we magically achieve herd immunity necessarily, because what that percentage is depends on the variants, the transmissibility of variants that are around, and also our own behavior. So if all of us decided for the rest of eternity to walk around wearing masks, then the percentage of people that would need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity would be lower than if we say, well, if we define herd immunity to be us feeling safe, walking around completely maskless forever. So that's why there's no magic number. It depends on a balance of our activity as well as our actual immune status. But the thing that's important and why achieving maximal vaccination and immunity rates is important is because even though right now, as far as we can tell, the variants for the most part appear to be you seem to be protected by the current vaccines. The reality is that viruses are living things. Well, that's actually kind of a technical question biologically, but they're replicating things that as people continue to be infected across the world, viruses are replicating, and that replication process is where variants and mutations happen. So the longer we let there be giant sinks of infection across the world and in our communities, so as long as we let there be inequality such that there are areas of the world or our cities where people are not vaccinated or are getting sick, there's more chance for a variant that escapes our vaccine efforts to emerge. And so this is why immunity in the population and not just among ourselves is important. So more vaccinations equals fewer infections equals fewer mutations and a lower chance of a dangerous variant emerging, okay? So as I mentioned, right now, we believe that the vaccines are providing protection against the currently identified variants. This could change, and this is something that like literally labs all over the world are constantly checking and trying to quantify. There are published data that in the lab, the neutralizing capacity of antibodies for varying different variants and the vaccine, that there may be different efficacy in the lab. On a population in human manner, this hasn't been shown. So right now, it hasn't been shown that, like, let's say you happen to get the P1 variant, which was originally identified in Brazil. It's not the case that if that variant comes here, your vaccination status is worthless. We don't know that at all. And there isn't data to suggest that. And if anything, probably right now, given the prevalence of, for instance, the B117 variant and stuff in the United States, we're still seeing decreasing levels of infection as our vaccination rate rises. And so clinically, it seems like the vaccine continues, at least at this moment, to be effective against the variants that we're seeing. Now, there's a question of post-vaccination antibody testing. So there currently is no specific recommendation from any of the professional societies to get routinely tested for antibodies. In our program, in our transplant program, and in our clinic, we are offering it with discussion with the patient about whether or not that information would be useful to them in helping stratify their own risk in their family and their mind and in their decision making. So it's not routinely recommended, especially for people who have normal immune systems. I would say, for the most part, you could likely assume that your antibody testing will be positive. And so this is an example of what antibody testing when you use a target specific panel like we do should look like. And what I'm pointing out here is that the SARS-CoV-2 nucleocapsid antibody should be negative if you've never had the disease. The spike receptor binding domain, S1 and S2, those are all part of the spike protein, which is what the vaccines get your body to make an antibody against. So this is an example of one of my patients. Obviously, their name and stuff has been cut out of the result. This patient never had COVID, but did get vaccinated. So their spike receptor binding domain, S1 and S2, are positive, but their nucleocapsid antibody is negative. This is the most useful kind of test if you really specifically want to know if your body made a reaction to the vaccine. Like I said, we are not mandating this. There's no recommendation that this needs to be done for all patients. But for specific patients who are immunocompromised, or especially those who've been transplanted, which we'll talk about in a second, we're offering this so that they can kind of understand their own risk and modify their behavior or not modify, it kind of help them and their families make decisions as we sort of continue to learn more about what to do. We have known for a long time that vaccines of all kinds are less effective or have a blunted immune response in immunosuppressed patients. So it is not at all a surprise. Like the COVID vaccine having lower efficacy in immunosuppressed patients or transplant patients is not particularly surprising, because we know that this is the case for the flu vaccine, for pneumococcal vaccine, for all of them. So often, the example that's often used is methotrexate, because it's so commonly used in rheumatoid arthritis. It's often recommended to hold medications like methotrexate for 2 weeks after vaccination for other illnesses. And I'll talk a little bit about what the recommendations have been from different societies in the case of COVID. But this is why I want everybody to understand that it's not COVID specific that vaccines may be less effective or generate fewer antibodies. This is something we see with lots and lots of vaccines. The first kind of really sort of very kind of troubling data, and sort of Shelley was likely referring to this kind of in our introduction, is that really early on, as soon as the vaccine started being rolled out, Johns Hopkins sort of did this kind of national study to get data very quickly on organ transplant recipients. So these are all organs, so kidney, liver, heart, lung, pancreas, and multi-organ recipients across the country. And what they showed is that after the first dose of vaccine, 20 days after the first dose of vaccine, antibody, which to the spike protein parts of COVID, was only detectable in 17% of the organ transplant recipients that they studied. What was interesting about this in particular is that it seemed to be more of a problem, or like the antibody response was more likely to be negative in people who are on anti-metabolites. So anti-metabolites are things like CellCept, which many of you may be on, because for autoimmune disease. And to some degree that makes sense, because anti-metabolites work to control your autoimmune disease by decreasing the ability of the cells that make antibodies to replicate. What's important to understand here is, especially for lung transplant and other organ transplant patients, I mean, they can't stop their anti-metabolites because the risk of organ rejection is life-threatening. And so they cannot do anything. They can't modify it or hold it or anything. So this is why all organ transplant patients were like of particular interest. I will come to rituximab in a second. Most Imuran is also is considered an anti-metabolite. Most organ transplant patients are not on rituximab, which is why it's not directly addressed in this paper, but I'm going to come to the discussion about rituximab in a second. The same group did a follow-up study that was just published that looked at, okay, well, maybe people didn't have as much of a response after dose number 1, but what about those? What if we follow them after dose number 2? And basically this chart is showing the granular data to say that 46% of patients who, again, solid organ transplant recipients, had no antibody response even after getting both doses. This is markedly different. Almost all patients, almost all of the people who are in the healthy, normal groups that were studied for the vaccine, almost all of them had antibody responses. So this is very different than what was observed in healthy people that were enrolled in the original vaccination trials. 39% had no response after the first dose, but did develop an antibody response after the second dose. So this emphasizes how important in mRNA vaccination it is to get that second dose. Antimetabolites, so like azathioprine or Imuran, mycophenolate, or CellCept, are associated with a lower likelihood of having antibodies in general. And again, to some degree, that's not that surprising because those antimetabolites are making the cells that make antibodies have a harder time replicating. That's how they work to control your disease, but it's also how they work to make antibody and immune and vaccination response lower. What about other immunosuppressed people? So this is a kind of a small preliminary study in people who are on different forms of immunomodulatory therapy for autoimmune diseases. So these are not solid organ transplant recipients. They're people who are have rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, lupus, those kind of diseases. And most patients with rheumatologic disease did end up having detectable antibodies. So if you looked at them as a whole group, 74% of them did have detectable antibodies, okay, after the first dose of the mRNA vaccine. This is not that surprising because that more of them than solid organ transplant recipients had antibodies, because solid organ transplant recipients are by definition on multiple forms of immunosuppression. So they're not just on one medicine. Usually they're on it, usually at least 3. So that it's not terribly surprising actually that this number is different. For people who are on TNF alpha inhibitors, so those are medications like Remicade, Humira. Those patients, for the most part, that particular medication subgroup was not associated with doing with lower antibody detectability. But again, in CellCept, it's mycophenolate, which is an anti-metabolite, people did have a high rate of undetectable antibodies. And in rituximab, which is a treatment that's very commonly used in autoimmune disease, specifically rheumatoid arthritis, but lots of them in general, there was a high rate of undetectable antibodies in people who were on rituximab. Again, though this is concerning, of course, for people on rituximab, this is to some degree an expected result because rituximab really attacks the kind of cells that create antibodies. That's how it works to control your RA. And similarly, it's just continuing to do its work, but accidentally also causing, not accidentally, but by design also causing a decreased response to the vaccine. So there isn't direct data. So in the setting of this vaccine, no one has done, well, all of the data that I showed you is all on the mRNA vaccines because they were the first ones that were rolled out. Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca have not been rolled out yet on a scale where like the similar data on, like I just showed you, that has not been published for the 1-dose vaccines. So we don't know yet, or at least I haven't seen yet that data. I'm sure people are gathering it. I'm going to come to the question of what not having antibodies means. I think it's not as clear as it means that you have no protection. I'm going to come to that in a second. So right now, there's no direct data on how to hold immunosuppression. So like I said, for organ transplant recipients, holding immunosuppression is not an option. And for anyone who's on this call who is an organ transplant recipient, please do not hold your immunosuppression unless you have specifically been instructed to do so by your transplant doctor, because the risk of rejecting your organ can be quite serious and real, and obviously rejection of your lung would be can be catastrophic. So I don't want anyone on this call to tell any organ transplant recipient to start holding their meds because that would not be the right message, and that is such a very, very complicated decision that needs to be discussed with the transplant physician. But for other diseases, especially if you have a rheumatologic disease that's under control, the general recommendations, again, based on minimal data, a lot of this is expert opinion, avoid vaccination during a disease flare. So if you're having an active flare that needs aggressive treatment to just control the symptoms, that would not be the right moment to get vaccinated. Hopefully you can treat through the flare and then get to some stability and then get vaccinated. You want to try to taper steroid therapy to less than 10 milligrams of prednisone a day if possible. If you're on things like Cellcept or methotrexate, 1 to 2 weeks before and after, after the vaccination, you should hold it if that is feasible. Again, some people have such severe disease that even holding medications for a few days can lead to severe health effects. So again, that should be discussed with your doctor and kind of thought through carefully. If you are on rituximab and you are on a 6-month dosing schedule, which is the most common one, the goal is to try to wait to around that 6-month post rituximab infusion time point, and then see if you can get that vaccine and then wait 4 weeks before the next dose for at least the first dose of the vaccine. The other option is to get vaccinated immediately and then assess at a later date with your physician and with discussion with your physician whether to do things like antibody testing to help understand your personal response. It's important while things are being sorted out to continue behavior modification, which we'll talk about more, masking and what people call social distancing to a certain degree, no matter, especially if you're around people that are not vaccinated. Even though the early data on COVID vaccination does not show an association between lower antibody rates and anti-TNF agents, in general, the recommendation is to hold anti-TNF agents, so those are things like Remicade and Humira, for 14 days before and after vaccination. So these are this is mostly based on expert opinion, but there are not true randomized controlled trials looking at this prospectively. So I want everybody to understand that this is just the best recommendation right now. But antibodies are not the entire story. So an important message that I want people to remember after this conversation, especially if they have had antibodies checked and are worried that theirs are negative, antibodies are the easiest to measure response to a vaccine, which is why they're often used as a surrogate marker of immunity, but they aren't everything. T cells are really important in fighting viruses, especially things like COVID. And so there is some mostly unpublished data that even patients with negative antibody testing may have T cell activity against the virus. So even if your antibody testing is negative, you may still be protected to some degree by T cell activity induced by the virus. That is harder to measure. There is an assay, a commercial assay that we're trying to get online to start using or offering or discussing with patients at Baylor, but it's a harder thing to measure. And there's more uncertainty about what those results mean because this is a new new virus, a new vaccine, a new T cell. The whole process, this whole test is new. So there's still going to be uncertainty about how to even interpret those T cell activity assays once they become more widely available. But my point in saying this is you should, if you're on immunosuppression and have not gotten vaccinated because you're worried that you won't have an antibody response, I would still get vaccinated certainly until we know more, because there may still be quite a bit of protection offered to you through non-antibody mechanisms. The thing that's concerning, of course, is that T cells themselves are also affected by things, antimetabolites like mycophenolate. So it has to be studied going forward whether or not T cell activity for people on mycophenolate and azathioprine and other things is also affected by whether their T cell activity is as high as other people's. Linda Gorman asked, my antibody testing was positive. Is there any way to know that what percent I'm protected? No. Percent protection is not always an individually measurable thing. So even those efficacy numbers that I showed before, when we say like, okay, the Pfizer vaccine's 95% effective, that's a population measurement. That's not an individual person's measurement. So, and as I'm going to come to, as I showed with the example from one of my patients, these are positive and negative results for antibody testing. In the lab, there are certain titers that they're measuring, but we don't know like necessarily what titer number is truly protected. Like we don't know if having a titer of some arbitrary unit of 100 is 100 times better than or is 10 times better than having a positive test, but the titer being at the 10 level versus the 100 level. There's not that kind of numeric like percentage translation for an individual patient is not, we can't really say that yet. So my point here is it's not clear that just because you don't have antibodies that you don't have any cell-based immunity. So again, we still recommend getting vaccinated, even if you're on rituximab, even if you're on CellCept, et cetera. So the areas of uncertainty that remain is how to time immunosuppression around vaccination, because most of these recommendations are based on the rheumatologists and other doctors' experiences with other vaccines and on expert opinion. And we don't know whether antibody testing tells us enough about your total immune response, and there's no way to put a percentage on it. And we still don't know how long the antibody response will last in immune competent or immunosuppressed people. So a thing that is being actively studied is even in normal people over time, there is a decay to some degree of the antibody titer, both from just getting sick, getting a natural infection or getting a vaccine. The Pfizer CEO recently kind of made news by coming out and saying, well, probably people will need boosters, and that may be true. He likely has access to data that others of us have not seen, but this will be something that's going to be actively studied, and data is going to be coming out in the weeks to come. And it would not surprise me at all if even healthy people have to get repeat doses in the future. What about boosters? So boosters are currently being studied. I don't know whether there's I don't believe there's an actively enrolling booster study at our institution. I don't know of one in Dallas. If people do know of one in Dallas, please feel free to share that information. But no, there's no data or ability to dose someone an extra time. So a lot of people are like, well, should I just get a third dose? And technically speaking, you probably have to lie to do that. So I can't, and we don't even know if that would be helpful, because right now the way that the government has bought vaccine, so in order to vaccinate as many people as possible. And so if you've already received both your vaccinations, going in and signing up for a third one, if they knew you had already had two, they would not be authorized to give you the third dose, if that makes sense. More importantly, we do not know whether or not that would actually make a difference yet. Denise asks, I'm on mycophenolate, received Moderna in January, February, didn't modify my meds. Are there studies I can participate in to determine the effectiveness? So I don't know of any specific studies right this second to direct you to. I can say that for my patients, we've had this conversation a lot, and we have some of my patients have chosen to check their antibody panel, as did the one that I just showed you, that positive on that previous slide. And the truth is, the majority of my patients, even some of my patients on mycophenolate and rituximab, many of them have antibodies. So I don't want people to leave this conversation either thinking I definitely don't have antibodies because I take rituximab. That's not necessarily the case, because many of my patients have mounted antibody responses despite being on both those medicines. I think there's going to be a whole host of factors that go into why, some related to age. Older people don't make as strong an antibody response to vaccines as younger people, et cetera. So I can't recommend to anybody to get another dose, because you would effectively have to lie to the vaccine administrator to be given another one. And right now, the country needs to focus on getting everybody vaccinated as much as possible. And more importantly, we don't know whether a third vaccine, what that would do for any individual person. I think there's very likely in the coming months going to be, as the CDC and the government understands more about the data around this, there may be recommendations for people who meet certain criteria to get revaccinated. So I would stay tuned about that for sure, and make sure to touch base with your doctors in a few weeks or months to see whether there's any change in that recommendation. Certainly Baylor would, our health system will likely reach out to people about this if that ends up being the case. So there's definitely signaling from the corporate entities that have developed these vaccines that they anticipate a need for revaccination. So I would not be surprised at all about this. Kathy asks, any idea why the Pfizer vaccine would cause AFib in an IPF patient? I don't know that the vaccine itself caused AFib in somebody, but AFib is often triggered by any form of stress to the body. So whenever a patient who has underlying AFib or underlying predisposition to AFib, or because AFib is extremely common, about, I want to say the number is something like 10% of people over 60 or 65 are walking around intermittently in AFib or permanently in AFib. For a lot of people, it's asymptomatic. So, but any form of stress to the body can trigger AFib. So when people get a really bad cold, when they get a pneumonia, when they get sepsis, a urinary tract infection, anything, and they come to the hospital and get treated for that, we often see that they will flip into AFib. So I think that if you happen to go into AFib after a vaccination, it is likely a response to the general sort of inflammatory state that a vaccine should cause in you in order to make the antibodies. And it would be probably no different than if you got a cold or other things. I haven't seen AFib in particular be like specifically associated with the Pfizer vaccine. So my guess would be that that's why the sort of stress of the inflammatory reactions, why a person might experience things like AFib after a vaccine. Nancy asked, I had both Moderna shots, not much of a reaction. For a day or a little longer, which I actually had a relief from scleroderma. Almost like my immune system had something else to concentrate on. That's an interesting idea. I don't know if that's necessarily been, I don't know if that others, I have not heard that reported in larger groups. So that's interesting to hear. So life after vaccination, we can move on to, I can talk a little bit about this and then we can get in. I think the next part is just actual people's questions they submitted. So this is a hard conversation. I think we can have more of an open conversation about it after I get through some of the submitted questions. What is okay? Well, everyone has to make individualized risk assessments. And this is what's really, really tough in a pandemic that lasts for years, or I mean, we're into year 2 now. So my general approach is that we can't judge others for being more careful than you choose to be. We don't know other people's situation. So I've seen a lot kind of in the sort of healthy, normal young person in the healthy, normal young person world of saying, well, stop wearing masks. You know, it's making people stressed. Even if you've gotten vaccinated, you should wear a mask. I don't think that's the right way to be. You don't know their situation. You know, as a daughter of a mom who's immunocompromised, like many of you, we still mask in public. I wear an N95 every second that I'm in the hospital or in the clinic. And so the it's not unreasonable to unmask in outdoor settings. So in the fresh air, in ventilated places, the risk of transmission is extremely low for COVID because we know that COVID is largely transmitted by aerosolization. So people breathing out and the viral particles getting breathed in by other people. It's probably okay to unmask around other vaccinated people. So within my family, I know that we all know that we have all gotten vaccinated. So we gather and we'll take off our masks in our small gatherings of our immediate family. But it's still recommended to wear masks in public places where you might be in close quarters with others, and especially when you don't know the vaccination status of other people. If it's possible, when you do socialize with others, socializing outdoors as much as possible is the safest thing to do. And even if you get vaccinated, no vaccine is 100%. So even if you got vaccinated and you have antibodies and all that stuff, or you're not immunocompromised, no vaccine is truly 100% in terms of preventing disease completely. And so if you have symptoms of COVID, so all the same stuff we talked about a year ago when this started, runny nose, sore throat, loss of sense of smell, et cetera, fever, get tested to protect, especially to protect others around you, and so that you can get care immediately, especially now that there are so many different avenues of getting care. This is outside the scope of this talk, but monoclonal antibody infusions and various treatments that are now, there's a lot of data on that hospitals would give people, especially people who have high risk, like most of you do on this call. So if you have symptoms of COVID, get tested, and if it's positive, contact your doctor immediately and follow all the quarantining advice that we've been sharing for months and months. Christine asks, are there more research references you might be able to send around about reducing cell set? So probably the most useful one, other than the Arnold and Sway paper, are the American, I want to say the American College of Rheumatology, the ACR, so the National sort of Professional Society for Rheumatologists, has a statement about this on their website. It was published, but also you can access it through the internet without I don't think there's any firewall with that. So if you Google that, they kind of outline what I said, but just in like more words and stuff. That's that. Oh, Shelly asked, what about air travel? Air travel is a good question. So the problem with air travel is that it's very hard to travel by air in a ventilated and remain in a ventilated space, right? And by definition, an airplane is going to be like completely pressurized and so I think that, and I'm about to travel. I have to travel somewhere in August, and to be honest, I would treat it, whatever you do when you're in a high risk indoor situation, I would continue to do when you're in airports and airplanes, because you can't distance. People are going to be right next to you, and you don't know the vaccination status of other people. So I would continue to mask for sure with air travel. Masking is the most important thing. I mean, the fomite, and we'll get to this with one of the specific questions people submitted. Fomite transmission is probably possible, and by that I mean touching something and then and getting COVID is probably possible, but is much less. It's way less important than the aerosol transmission. So that's why the masks end up being so critical to all of this. So now I will talk about your specific questions. So is getting an antibody test a reasonable way to judge what my response is? We've sort of talked about this, maybe not. If you have a positive antibody test, it's somewhat reassuring, but it doesn't tell you about your cellular immunity response, which could be impaired due to immunosuppression. Similarly, you might have a negative antibody test, but still be afforded some protection from severe disease by having cellular responses that are harder to measure commercially in a non-research setting. If so, what are number % of antibodies I'm looking for? Well, the problem is almost no I don't really know of any clinical lab that is going to give you a number or percent antibody result. You will not get that unless you are involved in unless you are working with a really specialized lab. In large part because the meaning of those numbers and percentages, that has not been validated in any way. So the lab cannot tell a doctor how to interpret that for you right now. We just don't have that knowledge. So it's going to almost certainly be a positive or negative, like I showed you before. Someone submitted, I had both Pfizer shots and finished up mid-February. Would it be useful to get a Johnson & Johnson vaccine if it's a different type? We can't recommend that right now. There's no data to support it, and it might be against the rules in terms of the fact that the government bought all of these vaccines to get everybody vaccinated across the board. And we have no idea whether giving you a Johnson & Johnson vaccine now would actually improve your antibody response. I understand the thinking behind that, and it's not an unreasonable thought, but functionally to show up at a vaccination center and ask for another one would be sort of lying. And I wouldn't recommend that. In June, my younger grandchildren have scheduled a 2-week visit, and I hope we don't have to wear masks the 2 weeks we're indoors. I don't think that will work. I understand that. I don't, if you've been vaccinated and they can get tested when they arrive, that would be an ideal situation. Any adult involved in this visit should be vaccinated, and everybody should be masked during travel for sure. Every family has to make a risk assessment individually. Unfortunately, there's no right answer to this. The maximally careful thing to do would be to continue masking, do as much visiting outdoors as you can, and have people get tested with at least rapid testing when they arrive. Karen asked, I'd like to participate in a study for third booster shots or for salsa. I don't know of any specific studies, Karen, to direct you to at the moment. So I can't tell you one in particular for your situation. Laura asks, does wearing oxygen on a plane increase your risk of COVID because the cabin air goes through the oxygen concentrator? I don't know. And I don't know if anyone's looked at that specifically. So I can't really speak to that. I don't think wearing oxygen in of itself on a plane increases your risk of COVID outside of the fact that if you have lung disease that's leading you to need oxygen, you're at high risk already. Teresa asks, the air filtration intake is on the floor near the windows. Okay. I'll let Teresa. Teresa, do you want to comment more on what you meant by that?
Yes, I have a couple friends that are airplane. They work for Boeing and the FAA. And typically when you use a portable oxygen on airplane, you sit by the window, you put your POC on the floor. And I always give them a hard time because I'm like, great, my concentrator is sucking in the air near the floor where all the dirty air is coming back in and getting sucked in and getting refiltrated. So they were trying to figure out the safest place. It was like a little science fair project they did on a plane. But the bottom line is time in the plane. How long is your flight? And are you comfortable taking that risk, right?
Yeah.
That's the bottom line of traveling.
I think that, and we've really grappled with this ourselves. Like what risk are we willing to, just me as an individual? I mean, there's no right answer. I mean, I've had partners travel for different reasons, for funerals and things like that during the pandemic, and they wore their N95s and kind of took as many precautions as they could, and they were okay. But there's no guarantee for any individual person, and I realize that's a really frustrating answer for people. But there are no golden rules here. And so I think, being vaccinated, being around people who are vaccinated as much as possible, and wearing your mask when you're around people where you don't know their status, is really the best you can do. I will say, this isn't, now that we have a lot of PPE in particular, if you have access to N95 masks, and you are really concerned about your risk and you have to do something like travel on a plane or be in a crowded place, if you can wear an N95, which I realize is not possible for everybody, but if you can, that is certainly a tighter seal and a much more effective barrier against a vaccine than a regular cloth mask. So another question I got is, what is the current understanding of the benefits of immune suppressed people to get the vaccine? I think there is a lot of benefit, because even though the numbers I showed you suggest that people have a lower rate of developing antibodies if they're on things like mycophenolate, not all people are failing to develop antibodies. All of my patients who are just only on CellCept, only on MMF, who got vaccinated and chose after discussing it with me to get their antibodies checked, have had antibodies. So just being on CellCept alone, it doesn't mean for sure you're not going to get antibodies. Christine asks, in regards to flights, long haul flights, 6 to 9 hours that require pre-COVID test to fly, is that of any benefit? Say more, Christine. What you mean? What exactly you mean by benefit?
So the long haul flights require you to test for COVID prior to getting on the plane. So I'm just wondering, does that mean that it's a safer flight, or is it we shouldn't really want to spend that long in the plane?
Yeah, I mean, so in general, all of us know people where this has happened. I mean, people can test negative for COVID and be in like a phase of disease. I actually just saw a gentleman who's in kind of a post-COVID recovery situation yesterday, who definitely had COVID and tested positive later in the course of his disease, but had a negative test initially. So there's still going to be those people in that window, you know, who so there's no, your risk is not zero, because even if people are all getting tested. But certainly if you're in a situation where everybody, you know, again, you're reducing your risk, but you're not making it zero, if that makes sense. I would still mask. I mean, if you guys run into me in Dallas, like, I mean, if I'm in a store, I'm wearing my N95. So I literally wear the same mask that I wear all day at work in the hospital. I wear a similar mask when I go into crowded places where I might be in close contact with people, in large part because I take care of so many of you, and I need to be super, super, super careful, even though I don't have an immune disease. I need to protect, not be a vector, and bring it to the hospital to you guys. Linda asks, if you had COVID, is still recommended wait 90 days, and there's a recommendation on which vaccine to take, or does it not matter? There's still the recommendation still exists to wait 90 days, I believe. As far as I know, that recommendation is still there. But which vaccine to take, or I don't believe there's no like instruction on which vaccine is better or not if you previously had COVID. I have had patients tell me, I have got COVID, I don't want to get the vaccine. And the reason I disagree with that, and I try to convince them otherwise, is that the antibody response after a vaccine, if you've had COVID, is way better. And so if anything, like, yeah, it may be annoying to get the shot, but you're at least boosting your own immune response to protect you going forward. And we know that people who've had natural COVID, like who just got it earlier in life, over time, we see that for a lot of people, there is a decay in antibody titer, meaning the amount of antibody you have as time goes by from your original infection. So getting vaccinated after having had the disease is still recommended. That's why it's still recommended. And but right now, as far as I know, there's no recommendation on a specific vaccine being better. How effective is my N95 mask when I constantly pull it down to clear my nose? It's not effective if you're constantly having to pull it down. The reason N95s are more effective is actually, I think, in part because it is harder to pull them down. Because when I wear it, and it's so tight around my face that I don't really want to mess with it. Whereas when I wear a regular mask, if I'm kind of just out and about and maybe just going to the park and just want to have it around in case someone comes near me, a regular mask they're very mobile. They're kind of constantly like moving around on people's faces, coming down off the nose and stuff. And so I think a large part of the efficacy of the N95 mask is that it's creating a seal and it's not really that movable outside of just fully taking it down. So my recommendations on minimizing this, there are a few different kinds of N95 masks. So different shapes of, like, some of them are more like duckbill ones. Some of them are more of the classic kind of round ones that we've always used in the hospital. So I would recommend you try a few different kinds and see if there's one that is more comfortable for you, that doesn't allow you, it doesn't force you to constantly pull it down. I wear one like 10 hours a day at work, so I've gotten very used to it since it's been a year of that. But that being said, I also don't have lung disease and am not coughing a lot. So it can be, this is why it's not always an option for everyone to wear an N95 all the time, and I understand that. As someone with 13% lung capacity, will being vaccinated really make a difference to how careful I have to be? I'm now protected from severe COVID, but I feel vulnerable to mild COVID. So getting vaccinated will decrease your risk of getting the virus and will further make the risk of severe disease very low, as we talked about. So the fact that, again, I think Dr. Fauci at some point said something like he was like talked about how amazingly happy he was when he saw that original data about efficacy. I mean, the data about 100% avoidance of hospitalization and severe COVID or hospitalization or death from COVID with these vaccines is similarly like a miracle. And so you're right, with 13% lung capacity, things are really rough. I mean, you're at really high risk even from any viral infection. And so I understand why it would seem like getting vaccinated may not change your life that much, but I think that it's any protection at that level of lung capacity is better than none. But I want to say that your sense of vulnerability is understandable and warranted, and it makes a lot of sense. Someone's asked, do we think we're going overboard by disinfecting all groceries that are delivered, stripping down showering after being close with others, even in doctors' offices? Yeah. So that question that just got texted in the chat box to me is similar to this question, which is about people changing out of work clothes and walking across the yard, showering, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the reality is that, as I mentioned before, almost all transmission of this disease is aerosol. So fomite transmission is now thought to be quite rare, and fomite transmission is what the technical term for when you get sick from touching like your groceries and then touching yourself. This is mostly aerosol. So you probably, I don't want, again, your risk is not zero from fomite transmission, but if you're going to focus your efforts on one of two things, I would focus it on aerosol. So on masking and keeping the house ventilated, potentially getting really high quality air purifiers. They're not those are not 100% protected. I don't want to give people a false sense of security, but it's one more thing you can do. Those efforts to kind of clean the air, keep ventilation going, things like that are probably better than and more effective than wiping down your groceries. We don't wipe down our groceries anymore. That being said, we wash our hands quite a bit. We try not to touch our face, things like that. What type of ventilation? So when I say ventilation, I mean as much as possible, you want to be around other people in rooms or whatever where the windows are open. Or outside. If you're in a room where you're just gonna have windows open, if you can put a fan that's pushing air out of the window so that it's circulating, that's a good idea. That's actually what we did for one family gathering earlier on in the pandemic. So yeah, and it's troublesome because that can be a problem for people who have allergies, which is unfortunately most members of my family have terrible seasonal allergies. So it's been tough in Dallas recently with that. So yeah, I think, ventilation really just means increasing the airflow so that the stagnant air you're not breathing the same stagnant air that others are breathing. You want things to be circulating so that the particles get dispersed from whatever people are breathing out. Teresa mentions going shopping, getting in and out. Agree. We try to spend as little time as possible in stores. I too miss shopping. Most of my shopping is now online, which is a bummer. I actually had a dream where in my dream I fantasized basically about, like, my dream was like this amazing happy dream about going into a store and looking at a sale table full of like leather purses, and in the dream I was just like touching the leather purses and thinking about buying them, and I woke up and I was sad because I don't do that anymore because of COVID. So I feel your pain there. Can pets catch it from the vet? There have been reports of animals catching COVID. I don't know of any serious outbreaks related to that. So if others know of like real outbreaks that have happened due to that, I'm open to talking about it, but I am not aware of that being a major transmitter. But it is true that some animals have tested positive for COVID. Laura had asked, how do you know if N95s are medical quality and where can you get medical? I actually don't know. And Bill and Shelley, maybe you have some thoughts on where the easiest place for people to get. I know that they're available because my husband and mother have definitely purchased them. I think online is probably a decent place, but there are actual like NIOSH and actually like certifies certain brands. So I mean, like if you get like a 3M brand N95 mask, that's probably a pretty reputable company. There are a few others, but they should have a NIOSH for the US people. There should be like a NIOSH certification on it. And it sounds like Shelley says Amazon has them. Yeah, I think that I think that's how my mom got hers as well. Steve asked, I had a cortisone shot in my knee for arthritis 8 days before my Pfizer shot. Would that affect the effectiveness of the vaccine? Probably not. Cortisone shots directly into joints, not as much of that steroid gets into your whole body. So in all likelihood, it probably didn't. Again, it's hard to say for sure, but a shot directly into the joint is less likely to be a problem than taking steroid pills. Last question, I think this is one of the last questions I had, is the question about mycophenolate rituximab. We discussed this earlier, but I think we can leave space here we can come back to that if people have more specific questions. And then I think this is one of the last questions about CVID and vaccines. Risk is low, but not zero around vaccinated people. But I would recommend the CDC guidelines about masking and avoiding crowds. Like I would take that pretty seriously. So it's a hard situation when you have an abnormal immune system. But if you look at the CDC guidelines, they're still pretty, they still recommend masking in crowded outdoor places and around people that you don't know their vaccine status. And I think that's the safe thing to do, and to try to certainly encourage people in your life to get vaccinated because that protects you. Karen asked, what about outdoor restaurants? So yeah, I think if you're going to eat out, I think eating at an outdoor restaurant makes the most sense. That being said, I mean, like sometimes there are outdoor restaurants, but they've created an enclosure that essentially decreases the ventilation, and so it's no longer an outdoor restaurant. So if it's truly outdoors, that's one thing. I think in some places have created, like in DC and on the East Coast, where it's like cooler. Until recently, they've had like the sort of pods outside, or like they've had like porches, but then enclose the porch. I mean, as soon as you enclose the porch with plastic or something, that's not outdoor anymore. That's like the ventilation is still staying within that space. So, Teresa asked, what would you say to people worried about going to see doctors and going to do health screenings? That's, I mean, that's a concern. And I think one of the things that we're really worried about in general, and when people, when physicians and healthcare system specialists talk about the true mortality associated with COVID, a lot of it is not just COVID itself, but also like people putting off other health things, and people putting off catheterizations, cancer screenings, things like that. So that's not an unreasonable concern. And I would say, again, mask as much as you can. Make sure it is completely reasonable if you are in a healthcare setting and a staff. I mean, I would hope that all of your doctors are masking around you, but if a staff member or support staff are not, it is completely appropriate to ask them to wear their mask and to keep it on their face around you. So I think, you know, it's been a year, and it's tough because we're not like totally out of the woods yet. And the only way we're going to get further out of the woods is everybody getting vaccinated. And right now there are only very few hospitals that are mandating that every staff member be vaccinated. So technically you can't assume that every nurse or respiratory therapist or support staff member has been vaccinated. So I think it's a risk benefit. I would talk about individual, like your individual risk associated with not doing a particular procedure if you're still worried. Talk about that with your doctor, have a frank and open conversation about how is this procedure going to impact my care and change my management? How much should we get it? And I think it's going to depend on each individual thing. Carlo asks, what about loss of effectiveness if your second shot's not administered until 4 months later? That's a really good question. We don't know the answer to that. So I can't give you hard data on that. I think getting the second shot is still better than not. So we don't know about exactly what happens if you wait that long, but it's certainly better than not getting it, to get it late. Kathy asks, our governor's lifting all bans at the end of the month. The emergency status will end by the end of next month. I worry that this will cause so much conflict. And worried about a medical procedure at the hospital. I agree. I think this is really hard. I also live in a state where the governor I'm actually not even sure anymore exactly what the regulations are. Bill might actually know more about where things stand in Texas. I think that it is really hard because when for me, taking care of so many people who've been affected by COVID, and I go out and I am walking around running an errand, wearing my mask and stuff, and then I walk by people not following any sort of advice we've talked about, that it really frustrates me. And I can imagine that you guys feel the same way. I think we can talk about, I think it's a good thing to talk about, and sort of discuss how you guys deal with it. But I think that you can only control and influence what you do and what the people around you do. And so if there's anything that I can say, that the biggest thing you can do to help, if you're worried about the pandemic continuing, which I think we all are, is to ask the young people and people who are vaccine hesitant in your life to get vaccinated. And if they're not going to do it for themselves, ask them to do it for you and to protect you. And that's what I've asked people that I know that haven't. So I think you can open it up to questions, comments, if people want to speak verbally too.
Just a comment, Dr. Mathai, and I agree. I think part of the problem is we collectively come from I'm going to say, a certain generation that are sometimes a little hesitant to voice our own opinion. And in this case, what we have to do is every day remind ourselves that number one is important and number one's us, and base our questions and our decisions, particularly in this convoluted marketplace of COVID. Take care of yourself first and take care of others second. That applies to patients as well as caregivers, because they have the caregivers, as we all know, have the tough duty here anyhow. It's a lot harder for them, I think, than for us. So I think taking the initiative of confronting, not confronting perhaps, but of saying, hey, look, I understand you have made your decisions and I support your ability to do that, but your decisions are affecting me. And for my decisions, I want to live. And if I want to live, you have to help me to take the proper precautions. Nothing wrong with doing that. And I think we collectively have to do more of that.
I agree. I agree. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, some relatives of mine who are very close to my mom emotionally, didn't get vaccinated until very recently. And she had to be like, well, I want to see you. I want you to be able to, be part of things, but our family is not going to be comfortable having you over when we know you haven't done it. And she kind of had to have that talk with them. And I know it wasn't easy and it was uncomfortable, but sometimes we just have to reach out to people as human and really make it about, like, I don't know how many of you guys have done therapy, but certainly in like different forms of therapy and couples therapy, a lot of times we talk about using like I statements. So instead of saying like you're being irresponsible by not getting vaccinated, that probably isn't going to work but if you say, I feel less comfortable and I enjoy the time, like I would love to have you be with me and come visit with me, but I can't be comfortable because my doctors and stuff are telling me that I need to try to socialize mostly with vaccinated people. Like, I love you and I would like you to be more part of my life. Could you do this to help me like deal with what's been a really hard pandemic? Sort of take that, like, it's not really about you. You're not really making a comment about their rights or whatever. It's more about like, how can you have a better relationship with them? Yep. Nikki sort of talked about posting stuff about her experience. Yeah. It's so many of you have gone through so much. So Nikki, thanks for sharing that. Any other comments or thoughts or experiences, things that you guys have done or found, life hacks that have helped you deal with all of this?
I think life hacks is a great word for it. I really do. I do have a question, kind of just spontaneous, is in dealing with PF, which is itself its own battle and its own fight and its own war. And then you kind of stir in the mix COVID. And I know there's no magic silver bullet out there. I understand that. Would supplementing diet have any impact at all on this whole thing? Is there things we should or shouldn't do? Because I know you're a fan of some supplements, not crazy ones. And you're also a great fan, which Patty and I now do. We take our shoes off when we walk in the house.
Yeah.
And you taught us to do that. So
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone on this call is Asian or has been over to Asian homes, I mean, Indian and Asian families like never wear shoes in the house, and so it's kind of for us it was easy to do that, but for others it's a change. I think so. I would say from a dietary perspective, actually I don't know that there are any real like supplements like that are relevant to like this conversation, except that I would say taking your regular vitamins, making sure vitamin D, you're getting vitamin D, but also we don't talk about this that much because it's a hard topic for a lot of people. But if you look at the risk factors for COVID, okay, the biggest risk factors for COVID, for getting COVID and for getting really sick with COVID were being older, being male, and having other health problems. Well, those three things are really hard to modify, right? You didn't choose to have the health problems that you have. You can't choose to be male or female. Well, I mean, at least by sex assigned birth. And you can't choose your age. But the other thing that was a really big risk factor that we didn't talk about that much is obesity was a huge risk factor. And so I think one thing, the more you guys can do to keep your weight within like kind of your goal that you and your doctors set for yourself, the better it can be. And that is related to nutrition and like, in the sense that staying active, it's a pandemic. Many of us have gained weight during it, but kind of like understanding that they're outside of just like the cosmetic stuff. Obesity is putting some people at higher risk for that. And I'll be honest, a lot of we do see a lot of younger COVID survivors who've had really severe disease come see us for follow-up after that. And what's striking is most, not all, but the overwhelming majority of young people who are like my age who got really sick with COVID were very overweight. And so that risk factor, and so even though they had their age going for them and their overall health going for them, the obesity thing was worked against them with the COVID. So I say that just to say, many of you are already putting so much work into staying healthy. Don't and at a goal weight. Don't stop doing that just because you're not. Find way working out outdoors, walking, being outside. Do that as much as possible, and watch what you're eating. So that that is really hard. It's a struggle I deal with every day, trying not to kind of eat my feelings. But it is a factor that we haven't emphasized as much, I think, in the medical community, because it's hard to talk about. I think Karen had
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that you hear about obesity, as a factor, but what about those of us who are way underweight? I mean,
I don't remember. I don't know that came out in the data, but part of the reason that may not have, it's never being part of the reason that was probably not as emphasized because it's less common a problem in the United States. But yeah, being underweight is a risk factor for illness in general. And so I think, working with nutritionists to help get you enough protein and all of your vitamins, and kind of proactively working on that, I think is a great idea. Like at our center, Nancy, I don't know where you are, but like, at our center, we have nutritionists that work with our patients who are working on weight, either low or high, and that's a huge part of our multidisciplinary approach. And so I would recommend really strongly, if you don't already work with a nutritionist, to kind of visit with one occasionally to kind of strategize to make sure you're getting the right nutrients.
I'm in North Dakota, but it seems like whenever I try to do just as for scleroderma itself, to eat healthier, to get all the nutrients, because I can't eat very much, then I lose weight, and then the doctors say just eat anything with calories. They're like,
yeah. For you, getting calories in is really important because of your particular disease. So I agree, just getting calories in, but then also just making sure there are you're taking vitamins and stuff like that to make sure you're also getting like the good stuff too. I'm just looking at the chat, but I think Karen had a question.
Yeah, I actually have two. So I'm getting feedback here. The first question is, so I'm fully vaccinated, but I also don't have antibodies, spike proteins. So, I have a friend who's a cancer patient. Do I count as a vaccinated person to visit her? Or am I not vaccinated? So that's my first question, is how to with your mom, if you were me, would you want me to be wearing a mask with her if we were meeting outdoors or something? And then my second question is about advocacy. I feel like I live in Colorado, like COPD got priority for vaccination over pulmonary fibrosis patients. And I think it's because they had a really good lobby with somebody. I don't know who, if it was a CDC thing or a state thing, but I'm wondering about booster shots, how we lobby for people with our health issues to get priority for booster shots.
So I'm not sure. So at least the way that and I don't know if it was how much it varied by state, but the general, the way that in Texas it was, if you were, 1A was like, doctors and stuff or something, but then like 1B was like anybody over like a certain age or if you had certain health problems. And that that comorbidity thing was pretty vague. Like they didn't like say you had to have COPD. Shelley and Bill, did they specify disease? I don't know that they really specified disease states.
Well, they did in Colorado because it was COPD, and I was so frustrated because I'm like, really?
That's really interesting.
A lot of it has to do with the numbers, though, Karen. Yeah, you look at the terrain as far as lung diseases, and we're a little blip, and COPD is a big bite. There are 10 times the number of COPD patients. So there's 10 times the amount of money being earned by companies, pharma companies and others in that marketplace. So they get the lion's share of the visibility. And there's been attempts in our area, pulmonary fibrosis, interstitial lung disease, ILD, to raise that awareness factor. And it's been a difficult struggle. And I wish it was happening better than it is. But one of the things that have been impacted, and I just make a comment, and Dr. Mathai, you can make a comment as well. One of the problems that I'm seeing develop, which we don't really talk about, and it's a real problem, is clinical trials. For us to get a cure, there has to be clinical trials. No trials, no cure. Well, we collectively now as a patient community are hesitant to get involved in a trial because you have to be at high risk to go to a hospital medical center. So you're kind of gun shy of doing that. And without trials, there is no cure for us. How to overcome that, I'm not sure. I talked to a doctor yesterday. Some of you know him, Natalie Kaminsky, about doing something to try to approach and remedy that. And it's a real problem that we collectively have to find a way to address. And so kind of keep your eyes open. June, maybe July, but June, I think for sure, we're going to do something about that as an organization. And when we do, Karen, I'm going to knock on your door and say, how can you help us in Colorado?
All right.
It's going to happen for us. It's not, unfortunately, it's not going to happen by somebody else. It's us. It's us marching in the street and raising our hand to say, we need a cure. And in your case, hey, you get COPD, you can live for a long time and control the symptoms. And our disease, you're not going to live a long time, and even if you do control the symptoms. So it's really an issue. I think it takes feet on the street and one voice, one message collectively. And I'd like to see that addressed everywhere, in addition to what you're pointing out, Karen.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I used to live in Colorado, so I don't know the structure now, like really, but it'd be interesting to reach out to your local, I guess your state government and try to find out who made that decision and maybe bring it to their attention. Because honestly, sometimes, and what I realize a lot of times when things like that happen, sometimes it's just simply as Bill's sort of saying, like, it's not malicious, but it's simply like people are not thinking. That it's likely that a pulmonologist was not involved in that conversation, because anybody who worked in our field would know that COPD is only one of like many lung diseases that would need to be prioritized. And so we probably have created it. So I think it would be interesting to, write an op-ed, like get it out there. People just don't know. And the other thing is my guess, Karen, and this is again just a guess. My guess would be that if and when there are booster rollouts, I would doubt that they're going to make it as trickle as they did the vaccine. And the reason I say that is because the criticism, the main criticism was that it was too slow. And in places that there were places, and even in Texas, I mean, there were places where some places it was really hard to get a vaccine, and other places it was like, they had extra, and we were trying to give it away. Yeah. And so my guess is they're going to be much less restricted now that they've and make bigger categories now that they've understood that it's going to be harder that people overrunning the system was not always the problem. So that's my guess. And I think they're going to learn from states that had it be a little bit more open-ended and not be that specific to disease. Because definitely in Texas, they said you should have a comorbidity, but they really didn't ask which one.
No, they were very specific here. And I was frustrated. I mean, it's like Jewish hospital is here.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm very surprised because I trained there, so I'm surprised that National Jewish being there did not change that. I do want to address. Denise asked about gyms. Okay, I loved going to the gym. And I have recently returned to visit a gym, but I wore an N95 the whole time. Gyms are really hard because think about what you're doing in a gym. You're there, very few people are wearing a mask in a gym. So to me, being in a gym is like, and then they're breathing super hard because they're running or lifting right. So they're taking in and out tons and tons of air. They're creating millions and billions and billions of aerosols. So I will only enter a gym wearing an N95 the entire time. So if I was going to name one of the highest risk things in my mind, based on the aerosolization issue and what we've seen now with super spreader events, probably because one of the super spreader events that was published about was actually like a spin class, because you're in there, you're in a room, you're going like that's extremely high risk. So I would put like things like gym, choir practice, really high because you're taking big deep breaths in and out, so you're getting a ton of exposure. And then second would probably be like like eating in an indoor restaurant because you can't wear a mask and eat, so everybody's unmasked during that period and you don't know what their vaccination status is. So unfortunately, even though I'm a huge fan of gyms, I think if you are worried about, if you're thinking about ways to mitigate risk, gyms are probably very high up there in terms of things to cut out. We've basically created like a home gym over the last few months because for the most part we haven't until like now, and I will only go in one if I'm wearing an N95 the whole time. I have IPF and also blood cancer. I haven't read much about blood cancers, but in general, when you have a blood cancer, it usually tends to impair immunity and immune response because those cells are basically what creates antibodies and immune responses. Does anyone know for sure how long we're protected after having both vaccines? So there has been some data again, from the original trial, so mostly healthy people, not people with other health problems. But for at least 6 months, the antibodies induced by the vaccine in the healthy controls or healthy people that were used in the original trials, they're seeing good antibody duration for at least 6 months. How much longer beyond that is stuff that's probably, again, being tracked and going to come out over the coming months. Sounds like PF patients were left out of the UK government. That's frustrating. Yeah, and sounds like the British Thoracic Society advocated and made change, which is really good. Yep, sounds like the Canadian, and there are some really great researchers in Canada and IPF, and so maybe reaching out to some of those folks at the Centers for Excellence, the IPF centers or ILD centers in Canada, having them kind of be part of your advocacy would be great, because there are research centers in Canada doing good work on IPF. So
And I'd also recommend to Gary get involved with the Canadian Fibrosis Foundation. They're run by Sharon Lee. They're out of Toronto. She does a lot of really great stuff in supporting support groups, advocacy, and awareness. So my first suggestion, Gary, get online, get involved with the CFF, and you'll benefit us and everyone else.
Kathy Colston, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do. Actually, what I wanted to hear was the answer to Karen's first question. Unless I blinked and missed it completely. She talked about if the spike test has shown that she has virtually no antibodies, how is she on visiting someone who is immune compromised? How safe is she there? And I'm really interested to hear what the answer to that is.
I would, if you know that, I would probably wear a mask around that person to protect them, for sure. And in fact, I think, again, it's complicated, but if this person is somebody who is pretty medically literate, I would probably disclose that information, like have a conversation like, hey, I happened to get my antibodies checked. They're negative. We don't know exactly what that means, but it probably means I didn't make as much of a good immune response to the vaccine as others. How should you and I, how does that make you feel? And what would you be comfortable with in terms of risk? And if, I mean, I know some people are not able to have that conversation. So, you know, if you're not able to, you're not, but I think disclosing it and being upfront. Also, I think they'll feel really good about that, you know, about you being that honest about it. Kristen asked about 6 months on first dose. I don't remember actually from that antibody duration study whether it was 6 months from the first dose or from full vaccination. So I don't want to say the wrong thing, but again, that's at least 6 months. So in normal people. So we'll have to see. It may be longer than that people have duration durable antibodies. Denise asked about KN95s. KN95s are pretty good. So I think if they're true KN95s, the efficacy of those is considered pretty close to the kind of traditional N95s that we use in hospitals. Yeah, Karen, about canceling a trip, that when she found it, yeah, that is really hard. I don't know what the right answer, and this is actually why, this is actually part of the reason that the decision to check antibodies is a complicated one, and that I talk through with patients before sending them, because, you know, if the patient really needs to think through, what am I going to do with this information, knowing that the CDC does not recommend, like the CDC doesn't have different advice for you if you test positive or negative for the antibodies, because there isn't enough information yet. So it's more of a conversation I have with people, and we kind of decide together, is this something that we want? How are you going to react to this? And what is our game plan as a team? If you have antibodies or don't have antibodies, let's think it through. Brian?
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am a lung transplant recipient. And last year, the Transplant Games of America, which were supposed to be held in the Meadowlands in New Jersey, were postponed. So now they're supposed to take place this summer, again in New Jersey. And my wife and I have been discussing whether it is safe to even consider going. that's kind of been on the table, and
Are
we're
they
leaning
doing it?
towards. What's that?
Are they holding it?
As of now, yes. I'm kind of surprised, but as of now, they're still holding it. And my wife and I have been discussing not going because of the risk. Just wanted another opinion on, I don't want to be wearing a mask and trying to participate in these events. And it does get crowded. It would be hard to social distance.
I will tell you that if you were my mom, I would say you can't go. And I would withhold the grandchildren from her if she was gonna still go.
Okay. Well,
because you're literally, I mean, if you think about it, you're not just going to a crowded place, but you're going to a crowded place with a bunch of people who theoretically may believe themselves to be vaccinated, but we don't know, but there's like reasonable evidence to think that they're not as protected as they think they are.
Right.
And that's like this probably, it's very hard to tell you this, but I mean, if I were your doctor, I would recommend that you not go, but I would recommend you have a conversation. I don't know who your transplant doctor is, but
I go to the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania.
My guess is going to be is if you ask your transplant doctor, they're going to be like, no. Don't.
Yeah, I probably agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I was just, looking for a medical opinion versus, what my wife and I have discussed.
Brian, you're looking for an excuse because nobody understands it more than I do, but I can tell you, we are not holding any face-to-face meetings throughout this year. And
Right.
Dr. Mathai, if I could adopt you, I would.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, you'd also be adopting 3 grandchildren. So
Well, that's a benefit, not
We
a
need
negative.
3 more.
We need
Bring
more.
them
We have. But I have to say, I'm going to kind of close things down because this has been a great meeting. And it's been a great meeting, I think, because of your candor, honesty, and being a human being and not just a doctor, Dr. Mathai. You're so smart. You're so well educated. You have such great insight and knowledge, and you share it without hesitation. And you're such a supporter and friend to us as PF Warriors. And I want to express all of our love for you and thanks to you. And we really appreciate here this Saturday. You could be out with your kids enjoying the day, and you're enjoying us, I hope, enjoying us. And we've really enjoyed you. And I want to say thank you. And I know everyone here chimes in and says the same thing.
well, thank you. I'm really, it's an honor to be invited. So thank you guys. I know this is it's been a tough year for all of us. And I think I want to say it's totally over. I don't know that it's completely over. I think we're in a way better place than we had. I think a year ago, I did a different talk about just like what COVID was. And we're in a different place now. It's a better place. I think it's a more hopeful place, but we're not out of the woods yet. And I agree with Bill that we do have to advocate for and share our knowledge. And your stories and your messages about how people you care about can change things and their behavior for the better are probably more effective than anything that the government can put out at this point. So, share your stories and get the information out there, and just, and like I said, I make sure. I think people who may judge you or something for wearing a mask or something like now, I mean, you just tell them you do you and I'm going to do me. And they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm out there walking around in Whole Foods with my N95. So I'm with you. So no worries about it.
Thank you again, Dr. Mathai. This will be recorded on live this next week at the pfwarriors.com site. If you're not a member of PF Warriors, please join us. It's free. It's the best deal in town. It's free. You get a great book on living with PF and access to all of our videos and a lot more information. But again, Dr. Mathai, you made my Saturday. I know Patty says the same thing. We're both kind of talking back and forth with each other. Great meeting. Thank you all for being here. And thank you again, Dr. Mathai.
You're very welcome. And if there are other questions that, Bill, please feel free to forward stuff that to me that didn't get addressed if people reach out to you afterwards. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks so much.